Shalom. We are live here at the TMS RoundTable. I am speaking from Israel. My name is Dr. Tova Goldfein. Here's my co-host, Rose.
Hi. Rose Ho here from Australia. I'm introducing you to Dr. Leo Russell this morning. He's an NHS psychologist who heads up the clinic in the Devon partnership of the NHS. I've got a couple of scenarios to give Dr. Leo. I'm afraid to leave the house now because last time I caught the bus, I fainted. My tinnitus is so bad, I can't even have a decent conversation with my friends. My arm goes numb, but I don't understand why. There's no reason for it. What do you think, Dr. Russell?
Wow. Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me to join you on your show. I've thoroughly enjoyed watching it, and especially last week's with Dion. It was great to see you all. So those are three interesting and common situations that we come across in this field. I think always it's important to say that the conversation needs to start with the family doctor, and in order to understand what might be happening in those situations, of course, it's important sometimes to rule out any other organic causes. So then in each of those scenarios, it's important, if you've ruled out the organic causes, to start investigating if there could be a relationship between emotional factors and anxiety and the functional symptoms. Each of those symptoms could be caused by anxiety in relation to emotional factors, and they each have slightly different anxiety pathways, which I'm very happy to talk about. I know obviously you'll be familiar with as well.
Well, maybe reiterate it for our audience, because they only experience the pain or the tinnitus or the fear, but draw the pathways again so that they'll get the feel for it, and also that they come up at different times as well, depending on the stress level.
So I think one of the first things to recognize is that we're creatures who are designed to have feelings that give us an indication about what we need. But sometimes when we've faced experiences in the past where we've had feelings about what we need, and then that's been responded to with rejection or withdrawal or hurt, then what we experience is a danger signal in our bodies. So the danger signal that we can experience in our bodies is anxiety. Right? That's designed. I don't know if you guys ever played Top Trumps at school. So it's this game. It's this game we have in the UK, and the idea is to have the top trump. It's a card game, and our brain has this format where we can think of it as falling into three parts. We have our thoughts, our ability to think, which is about planning for the future and solving problems. And then we have our emotions, which tell us about our relational needs. And then we have our anxiety, which just tells us if we're at risk of harm in some way. And our emotions trump our thoughts, right? So when we're in an emotional state, it's hard to think necessarily in a cold problem-solving way. But anxiety trumps our emotions because ultimately survival is just slightly more important than relationships, although, of course, relationships are a key part of our survival. So anyway, so what can happen is this anxiety, when it's activated in our brain, these ancient centers in our brain, this actually prevents us being able to access our emotions, and our emotions tell us what we need and what our longings are. So this is a pretty critical situation.
I have a quick question. Just where does the fight, flight, freeze mechanism fit in here?
Yeah, it's a really great question, right? So our anxiety is organized into different levels of response. Now, the first part of our anxiety response is actually before fight and flight, is social engagement, right? So this is our capacity to respond with our facial musculature in a engaging way to reduce the tension in the situation. We see some people who are really great at this, like Barack Obama or Elizabeth Warren, who respond in ways which just like cool the situation down. And you know that they're regulating their emotions brilliantly in order to do that.
So in other words, they feel stress underneath, but when you say regulate their emotions, they're like thinking, wow, this is a stressful question. I think I'm just going to stay calm and respond, but inside I'm really angry.
Yeah,
possibly.
That's right. So they know this. It's a really great point you pick up on. They notice they're having feelings, and the noticing it enables them to regulate that. And perhaps we'll come back to this later, because I think it's really fascinating, the brain areas that are involved in helping us deal with our emotions. But I think it's really important, as you say, to get to this issue about the anxiety pathways. So the first anxiety pathway, which you pointed out after social engagement, is that if we're faced with a difficult situation, then we get this fight and flight response in our body, which essentially is our body produces a lot of adrenaline, our heart rate increases, we get dry mouth, dry throat, we get tension in our voluntary muscles, right? So these are the muscles in our hands, arms, shoulders, back of our neck, back of our head, intercostal muscles, and down into our stomach and our legs and our feet. And this gives us the ability to run away or to fight as required. So this kind of pathway, we'll see, is something that we all need at various times in our life, and it's good to be able to have fight and flight response. But when people have in the past, very early on in their life, faced situations where they have been, as I say, hurt or had emotional withdrawal from people that they love, from their parents, from their caregivers, this anxiety can come up and is conditioned with the emotion. But when people have fight and flight anxiety, what that tells us is that there was some way that they could escape, right? So they learned that this is a difficult situation, but they had some other avenues they could go to that would help them out. I sometimes think of it like if you have a cat that brings in a mouse, the first thing the mouse does is it tries to run away, right? So that's its fight and flight response, because at that point the mouse has hope that it can get away. So this kind of anxiety is fine for brief periods, but when it's chronically getting activated in our life, if you imagine you've got chronic tension in your muscles, then it's going to literally be as if you've been to the gym all day, every day, and that's going to create pain. And it can create tension headaches, and it can create a sense that you're having a heart attack from the pressure on your chest. So when we see those kind of symptoms, then we start to be interested in, okay, this fight and flight pathway is pretty critical. What's the emotion underneath this that's triggering it? And then you mentioned as well the freeze and flop pathway. And
the mouse is the ideal.
Right, exactly. So what happens next? Exactly. When the cat
doesn't give up hope. We can't give up hope. The mouse could get away. In 1 second, the cat could open up his mouth to breathe, and the mouse could get away.
Which is what we would love to be able to happen if we could just get this mouse to get away. But we're smart, right? These organisms, I'm always struck by just how incredibly intelligent we are as creatures. And I say we, I'm including mammals in that, because if the mouse can't escape and the cat does get the mouse in its mouth, it does what we call playing dead, right? But of course, the mouse isn't putting on a like Oscar-winning performance. This is a physiological response which is happening, which is we call it sham death, and we all as mammals have the capacity for this. And what happens is that there's a part of our brain, the 10th cranial nerve, which has this part called a dorsal vagal complex. When that engages, our heart rate drops below resting rate, and we start to lose muscle tone, okay? And we start to have difficulty thinking and concentrating because we're not getting, our blood pressure isn't high enough for our brain to function at its high levels. And essentially, it immobilizes us. And again, this is the best strategy if there's nothing we can do to escape. And this is hardwired into our body.
Can I interrupt you for a moment?
Yeah, sure.
The conversion disorder, how's that related to that?
Yeah.
Explain that. Explain what conversion disorder is, please.
Yeah. So conversion. Well, I think first of all, I think it's.
I'd never thought of it like that. That's all.
Yeah. Well, this is the things that get called conversion disorder. Rose, it's key that you're right to bring it up here, because this is where those kind of difficulties typically stem from. I hover over the word conversion disorder because, like many of the terms that get used in trying to understand functional symptoms, it's one of those that some patients find difficult because of some of its history. But I actually think it does describe something important that's happening, which is the energy in the body is being converted on a physiological level. So you get this sham death response. And for people who have an episode where they collapse, as you described in one of the initial examples, or where they get weakness in one of their arms, or they get paralysis, which is something we often see in our clinic, this is literally the human version of the playing dead that we see in mice. And it's really important that the person isn't aware that they're triggering this, because it's not a conscious process.
No, but neither, I don't think, is the playing dead a conscious process.
Exactly.
It's a fear that shut them down, isn't it? The cortisol.
Yeah, it's the fear. So it's this dorsal vagal complex that kicks in alongside, as you say. There's a raft of physiological responses when we're in danger, which are all designed to give us the best automatic response to get out of that situation. And sometimes if we can't get out of the situation in our body, then the only way we can get out of that situation is in our head, and we get dissociative episodes. Which means people aren't conscious, right? So they have no memory of what happened in this moment when they collapsed, or they might even be doing, I've seen examples where people, for instance, have had amnesia for several years of their life as a consequence of a degree of chronic dissociation. Which is just, living in a very high state of fear.
So now today, somebody has stress and their fight or flight mechanism behaves like there's a lion coming.
Yeah.
That's what a lot of our clients and patients know intellectually, but I would, for them to understand this so they can say, I'm not going to let that happen. I'm going to calm my nervous system down. How would you make that a simple 1 and 1 equal 2?
Yeah. How do we calm the nervous system down?
Yeah,
this is the $1 million question.
Right? Knowing that I can avoid all those physiological actions, tension, muscle, holding my breath, dizziness. If I could just breathe, pray, whistle, sing.
Yeah. So there's lots of layers to that question. one of the important things I think for people to hold in mind when they're suffering with these kind of functional symptoms, which I think we all will experience at one point in our life, some kind of functional symptom. I think it's useful to first remind ourselves that our body is on our side, right? So it can often feel like it's against us. But our body is just trying to keep us safe, but probably it's confused. And what makes it confused is that it's learned something which is relevant to the past, but is not relevant to the moment. Wow. So you take the example of someone feeling it's like often they'll feel as if there's a lion in a room. They're anxious and they don't know why they're anxious. And sometimes you'll note this as if you're a therapist or a chiropractor or an OT or a physiotherapist, you'll be sat in a room with someone and you'll ask them a ostensibly a normal question and you're not being too frightening, and they'll respond to the normal question as if you are sat there and they're at the zoo and they're in the cage, and you're a lion and they're in the cage with you. So the first thing is to notice that there's a difference between the actual danger they're in and the way their body is responding. The second thing is to pay attention to the physical symptoms they're experiencing, and then the emotional experience underneath in their body. Now that sounds like a very simple thing, but it's not. As Rose was pointing out, it's extremely complicated, right? Because usually it's when we're born, we have emotions that help us to get our needs met, right? And we think about all the core emotions. That's what they're there for. If we're separated from our caregiver, we automatically have grief, and grief is a painful feeling, so we automatically avoid separation, right? But should we be separated, the impulse of grief is to cry out, right? And that's a distress signal. And then in good enough, to borrow Donald Winnicott's phrase, in good enough attachments, our parent will then come and meet our needs. So our emotions have a function. And at the same time, of course, as we get older, we need to be able to bear and tolerate separation. That first starts, those first moments when you go into kindergarten or preschool or whatever it is, and there's separation there. Your parent the parent has to be able to respond to your emotions by seeing what you're feeling, letting you know that it's okay, and letting you know that you can cope, and sometimes showing you how to cope. Right? And we call this attunement. Can
you describe that a little bit more, because it's an important developmental thing for families. That whole idea of not crying with the child, but being attuned. What it really means.
Yeah. So I would say the best way to think about that is just picturing what the experience of holding a baby. When you see the baby experiencing some kind of emotion, what do you do? How do you respond to the baby? Right. And typically, what we do is we produce like a mirror of what the child's experiencing. So if you see the child crying, you might find yourself going, "Oh, I know it's upsetting. It's okay. It's okay." And you're reflecting back to the child their emotion, but you are in a also
reassuring.
A reassuring state. Exactly.
Yeah.
So what children learn over time is that their emotions are okay. But the reason I bring this up is because this actually helps them to develop the neurological capacity to regulate their emotions throughout their life. There was really interesting research. If you look at the brains of infants at 18 years old, and you compared infants who'd had healthy attunement experiences, so experiences where the parents were able to respond to the feelings in a sort of a supportive way at the right time, versus children who didn't get that opportunity with their parents. What we see in that those kids who had the healthy attunement experiences, we see that they literally have, there's a part of their brain which is larger and more sophisticated in its neural connections. And that part of the brain is called the right orbital frontal cortex. Now, this is the part of the brain that regulates our autonomic nervous system and our central nervous system and our emotions. So what we're trying to do later on in life is we're trying to recreate that process, in a sense, when you're working with people who have functional symptoms. And in fact, when you are yourself noticing functional symptoms, you're trying to think about the symptoms you're experiencing, think about what might be causing it. And you may need to do specific exercises depending on the level of anxiety. And I'm happy to get into that if that's...
well, would you please? Because that's important. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. First, I just want to be clear that everyone understands in our audience, you know, it was actually a new term for me in the last, 5-6 years, regulating emotions. So as a child, our emotions are emotions, but then they get regulated or not. So it's like an imbalance of emotions. And can we ever balance them? Is something we can do? Is it something simple? Or just, regulation of emotions is a little foreign to me, and I think to some of our audience.
Yeah. So our feelings tell us what we need, right? They tell us our longings, what we need. But the world isn't quite so straightforward as that. We can't always have what we need right now. And so when we have our feelings, we also need to be able to notice them and understand what that feeling is, what that feeling means, where it's happening in our body. And then we need to be able to act on the feeling on the basis of our longings. And when we're talking about regulating our feelings, what we're really meaning is making sure that we are not being overwhelmed by them. So, and there are two parts to this, really. The first part of it is often our emotions, as we were saying earlier, when we learn that our emotions become associated with danger, our emotions trigger anxiety. So part of regulating our emotions is regulating anxiety. And the way we regulate the anxiety depends on what system it is in our body. Does that answer the question, Tova?
Yeah. Well, Leo, I wonder if you'd expand that a little bit and just give us a little scenario of how when the patient comes in and they sit down in front of you and just go through the process of helping them to notice their anxiety. Pretend you've got someone in front of you at the moment, or, and just sort of demonstrate it in a way so that our audience can actually get the gist of it, because theoretically we haven't made that sort of like solid connection that they can actually see in their own minds how they'd react if they were sitting in front of you. And the other thing maybe to mention now at the moment is that many of you may become disrupted by this conversation. Can you just sort of reassure people about that too, Leo? That as they listen to this conversation, their stomach may be starting to rumble, or they might get a bit of a headache or tightness in the face. Can you? Yeah,
thanks for bringing that up. So as we're talking about emotions, about the significance of past experiences, and paying attention to ourselves, that in itself could be triggering emotions inside of you. In fact, it will be triggering emotions inside of all of us. We can't do anything about that, which is positive, but also challenging at times. So what you might notice is that emotion might be triggering some anxiety, and that anxiety maybe making it difficult for you to concentrate or focus. If the anxiety is going into, sometimes with anxiety we start to shut down somewhat, our blood pressure drops, and it's difficult to concentrate and focus, or we can have sort of blank moments. But another place anxiety can occur in our body is in what Dion was describing last week, for those of you who saw that, in our smooth muscle system. This is basically our digestive system, our blood vessels, our airways. So it can cause cramping, or sometimes this can cause diarrhea, constipation, an urgency to go to the loo. Sometimes it can cause dizziness. So you may even be just watching this discussion and finding that you're having some of those symptoms coming up. And if that happens, just take a moment to notice where you are, right? So you can just look around the room, notice what you can see, and notice perhaps what you can feel, notice what you can hear outside of this conversation. And this is what we call grounding techniques. And this is to come back to Tova's analogy earlier. What happens when you ground like that is essentially you're reminding your body that where you are is safe. Okay?
Right. And that's the answer to one of the questions. I just want to say, interesting, Sophie, who's from, I think, Switzerland or Sweden, how do you tell the body it shouldn't fear symptoms? So we're learning to ground, and the grounding technique, that would be a wonderful take-home tool. So before you go on, which I'm very interested to hear you go on, but this is a wonderful take-home tool. People can do it right now. I can do it right now because I'm just starting to feel better. That I'm so happy you got on the internet. You got on this, the Be Live, Leo. We were a few minutes late, and you were amazing. I was almost going to have a stand-in for you, but you came in. I'm calming down, and I'm breathing. And so Sophie wants to know, how do you tell your body it shouldn't fear symptoms?
Okay. So this comes up a lot because, so I was describing the three parts of the brain, the anxiety part, the part which responds to anxiety, a part which responds with emotion, and a part which responds with thinking. The thinking part of our brain is often very helpful because it looks out for problems, but sometimes it gets a bit keen and it starts seeing what's happening in our body as a problem in itself.
Excellent.
Well said. Well said.
So when we notice these physical symptoms, I think it's helpful to know about the different pathways, because you can remind yourself that your body is just doing what it's designed to do. It's just confused, right? And because these mechanisms are inbuilt to the body, generally speaking, any single incidence of them isn't going to cause you any harm. If you have diarrhea or constipation, for example, for a short episode of anxiety, that's not going to cause your body any damage. Our bodies are tremendously adaptive. And again, the thing with these anxiety symptoms is sometimes it's worth recognizing that our body is basing its decision on the wisdom of 3.8 billion years of evolution, as opposed to the 38 years or whatever it is of our life that we've got. I think it's worth trusting our bodies a bit. And sometimes, I'll say to people, take a moment, and when you notice one of these symptoms, let's say you notice your arm is going weak, and just say to your body, thanks very much. I know what you're doing is trying to help me out here. I think you're a little confused about the situation, but it's okay. We'll figure this out together and we'll get through this.
Take a bow. Amazing. And then what do we do if that doesn't work? No, go ahead. I'm only kidding.
No, well, when Leo gives our little demo of a person's anxiety in front of him in the room, you'll get the...
Okay. So I'll give, that's fine. I'll give you an example which I'll see quite a lot, which someone perhaps will meet me for an assessment, And I'll just start by asking them about, what's the problem that they'd like my help with. And they'll start giving an answer to that. But then about 10 seconds in, they'll suddenly sort of lose their track of thought. And they'll say, oh, sorry, what were we talking about again? So that's a really golden moment, in fact, because in that moment, it gives me the opportunity to say to them, so do you notice that as you were going to answer the question about the difficulties you're experiencing, the problem you'd like my help with, in that moment, you started to have difficulty thinking and concentrating? And often they'll say, yeah, in fact, I noticed that happens quite a lot. And that didn't used to happen for me, but that seems to happen a lot right now. And sometimes they'll say, oh, and I thought maybe I was developing early onset dementia or something like that. And in fact, I've been quite anxious about that. So then in that moment, I say, well, let's understand what's happening in your body. Right? So as you sit here with me, what are you feeling inside? And they might say, oh, actually, now that we stop, I noticed that I'm also feeling kind of a bit dizzy. And actually, my ears are ringing a little bit too. And so then I'll say to them, so are you aware that those are symptoms of anxiety? And typically they won't be, because, of course, we're not taught this. In fact, even if you do medical training, you're not taught this either. So we say, okay, so obviously there's some anxiety right now. And they'll say, okay, right, so I think about this anxiety. And so then I might say to them, do you have any other physical symptoms? So we go through a list, and I would normally list off the full range of ways in which anxiety can manifest in the body and create physical symptoms. So we know what we're dealing with. And once we've done that, then we'll go back to the beginning and we'll take a look at, obviously in this first moment in which I asked you about the problems that you'd like help with, obviously that triggered some anxiety. So would you like us to take a look at what's underneath that? And if they're happy to do that, then I'll ask them what their feelings were that came up as they sat down with me. What were the feelings that came up towards me? And then we start to understand emotions might be driving anxiety.
Can you just go back for a moment? When you asked them what the feelings were towards you when they sat down in front of you, explain to the audience how there's not usually a response about that, because that's the gap.
Yeah.
That as therapists we need to close somehow.
Yeah.
And that's the gap that our patients don't understand. That how is it that my thoughts aren't my feelings?
So that's funny because it's a big question, but it's super important. So I think it comes back to recognizing that our emotions evolved so we can deal with relationships. So every relationship you have will trigger an emotion when you come across that other person. And if that other person is offering to help you, boy, that will trigger real emotions, right? Because
that's the worst.
That's the worst, yes. So because, of course, we're vulnerable, right? When we're accepting help from others, we're very vulnerable. And that's fine if we've had experiences in our life where when we've needed help, the help that's been offered has been appropriate and to the right degree. But if the help we've been offered hasn't, at those times we've been vulnerable, then what we experience that feeling as is actually as danger, and then we get anxiety, right, in our body. So as soon as someone sits down to an encounter with another human being, this will be producing emotions, and that's particularly pertinent in any medical assessment or meeting with a therapist or a doctor or a meeting with a friend. This would happen all the time. So emotions are natural to experience, but we struggle to talk about emotions. I think we forgot about emotions. Is my sort of maybe contentious view. If you look at the, if I can take a segue for a moment, is that all right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Of course.
If you look at,
you're the guest.
All
So
right.
Then we're going to answer some questions.
Okay. Cool. I'll keep this relatively brief. Yeah. But if we look at how frequent the word feeling is versus the word thinking in literature, right, public literature, what we see is that in the early 1900s, and for most of the 1900s, feeling was much more prevalently talked about than thoughts. Okay, it was just much more common. And then in the 1980s, this switched over, and we see that thinking becomes talked about a lot more than thoughts. Which is a bit curious that this would happen. Now, of course, the thing that happened in the 1980s was we had the computer revolution, the technology revolution, information processing. So, like has always happened through the ages, people started thinking about our minds and the brain using the technology of the day. So they started to think about our brains and our minds as if they're kind of like computers, right? That works with logic. And in some ways, this advanced thinking about the brain to some extent, but what we've actually found is that our brains and our bodies aren't like computers. We don't work on binary code. And in fact, as we came through to the late 1990s and the early 2000s, neuroscience was showing us that, hang on, guys, emotions are pretty important here. Because they were getting the technology that could really understand what's happening in the brain. So I really feel like we forgot about emotions and we stopped talking about emotions and we started to think about ourselves more as our thoughts. But our thoughts typically, like our beliefs, whilst they are important, they are typically secondary to our feelings. We feel first and think second.
Great point.
Yeah, actually, that's good. Yeah,
good point. So I want.
In actual fact, sorry.
Well, I want to say, I want to. Rose and I will get plenty of time to talk later. So I'll say one thing, and then Rose can answer because I did want to answer. Janet asked a question. Janet from Australia, and she has an accent like you guys. But what's beautiful, what you're saying, is that everything you're saying is that we have to remember we are in control of our reaction. So Janet's question, she's from Queensland. She has primary progressive MS and her mobility is severely deteriorated and she cannot move about easy. Is this making her anxiety worse? Because she says she cannot run. Now, my just quick answer is, Janet, good question. It's your reaction to what's happening that's more important than anything. So the fact that you can't move quickly is a fact, but your reaction will slow you down even more, as opposed to, obviously, and that can go in deeper, and we'd love to, and Rose will answer that after the meeting. Rose will answer some of the questions, but understand that, Janet, you are in control of your reaction. That's the power here that we're talking about. What do you think, Rose and Dr. Russell, about that?
You go ahead.
Sure. Okay. I think that's a really important point. We go back to some of even the first teachings of Buddha. He spoke about how in life there is pain, but what we do with it can turn it into suffering or not. I think I probably just butchered that, but
well, John Fredrickson's coming on, so that's one of my questions to him.
Excellent. Oh, great. Oh, you'll have a great time with John. Brilliant. Yeah. So, but it's absolutely right. we can respond. If we respond to our distress with distress, then we just end up in this cycle like we're in quicksand. And you know, in quicksand, the more you struggle, the more you sink. So taking that time to just notice your response, and let yourself know that you're doing the best you can. You know, life is tough. For being an organism is tough, right? And being a human is tough. And being a human who's suffering with a very serious condition like MS is tough. So, you know, you're doing a great job to be keeping going and doing your best to look after yourself. And so just remind yourself of that, and let yourself know that it's okay to feel anxious. But again, let your body know, I've got this one. It's okay. Thanks for the anxiety, but I don't need it right now.
Beautiful. Rose, you want to talk about the next question, unless you wanted to answer that to Janet.
No, I was just going to say we've got a number of people who've got tinnitus.
Yeah. Here's Scott's question. Have you any advice for meditation and sleep with tinnitus? He uses Headspace and enjoys meditating, but he's constantly distracted by the tinnitus. So
tinnitus is really challenging. And as I guess, as with a lot of these situations, it's always worth seeing experts in that specific speciality in case there's anything that's being missed. But tinnitus can be caused and or made worse by anxiety, by quite high levels of anxiety. So what I would recommend is, well, there are two things. One thing I'd recommend is trying out a breathing exercise. So doing an exercise where you are breathing at a at a regular rate, I'd say, about 4 seconds. Breathe in, hold your breath for 4 seconds, breathe out for 4 seconds, hold your breath for 4 seconds, and repeat for several minutes. That's one way of trying to regulate your nervous system. Another thing with tinnitus is it can be helpful if people are getting tinnitus as a result of this more extreme anxiety response that goes towards this freeze and flop response we were saying earlier. Sometimes what they need to do is actually increase their blood pressure. So if you're sitting down meditating, then actually your blood pressure might be dropping, and that might be making the symptoms worse.
Exacerbated, yeah.
Yeah, so you get up, walk around. Sometimes it can be helpful to, if you take your, I'll show you, I don't know if you can see this, but if you take your arms both sides and you tense up your arms like this on both sides and just hold that for 30 seconds, see if that makes a difference. That can sometimes be good with those kind of symptoms. So I guess those are some of the main things. Oh, there's one other thing I'd say about that, which is meditation and mindfulness is an invaluable tool because it enables us to start to notice what's happening inside. Sometimes what happens when we stop is our feelings start to come up. And if our feelings are what's triggering our anxiety, then sometimes we need help and support to talk through the feelings that are coming up. This is why sometimes people have, they try mindfulness, but they have real difficulty with it because it brings up painful feelings and they're not sure what to do with that.
And the painful feelings make the anxiety worse, don't they?
Exactly, yeah. That's really crucial.
Cycle. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So then the work is to process the feelings that are underneath and to understand where they come from and what they're about.
Yeah. Leo, in that sort of context, I think it's important, maybe you could elaborate on it a little bit, about having someone to walk this walk with you. Because many of these people that are watching are struggling on their own. Yeah. And they've already been to, like we've had people on that have had 25 doctors and things like that, and they've given up hope. Yeah. So to find the right sort of person to walk with them
Exactly.
And what we do, what's emerging with the type of work we do, is that we walk with the emotions and hold them safe. Could you just talk a bit about that, too, please?
Yeah. Well, I think you've summed it up really well, to be honest, Rose. That we're not designed to process our emotions on our own. That's just from birth. Our emotions are about a relationship. So it's actually hard. It can be hard to feel on our own unless we've had experiences early on in our life where someone else has helped us to feel on our own, to have feelings on our own, I should say. So it's super important that when you're looking for someone to help you through these kind of symptoms and through the emotional path, that the people that you're working with, if they are medics or perhaps physiotherapists or OTs or chiropractors, you want to make sure that you're working with someone who can think psychologically, who's willing to think with you psychologically about your difficulties. In the same way that if you're working with a psychotherapist or a psychologist, you want to find one who's willing to think with you physiologically, right? Because these kinds of symptoms are, one way of thinking about it is they're on the bridge between physical health and mental health. So you really need to find someone who works on that bridge and in an integrated way.
And I think what Rose is saying is, and how you answered it, is that we teach, I think, therapists, and what we do is to teach you these tools, and it's not something you're going to learn overnight. It's a habit. And, Mia's question is, she understands her fight and flight. She recognizes it. She can't get out of it. She tries breathing. It doesn't work. It's not that you have to just, it becomes a habit. We get up every morning and we brush our teeth. How do we learn how to do that? How do we learn how to drive? How do we learn how to ride a bike? Yeah. Rose, what do you say about that regarding the habit of being in touch with our feelings? It's something we have to learn.
I think when the anxiety comes up, the habit goes away. So when you're calm, you can do it. But when you're confronted with a doctor in a white coat, in inverted commas, the habit's gone out the door. Whereas if in the calmness of just being in the moment with the meditation or the breathing, you can calm that down. But in actual fact, calming it down isn't going to cure the person. What cures a person is breaking through the anxiety and recognizing that there's no saber-toothed tiger in the room.
That's it. Yeah. Excellent.
And what I'll do is I'll put up the Tronic still face clip again, so that people watching can realize that this has happened very, very early on usually, and it's about lack of attunement. As Leo was saying, if we aren't attuned as parents, we're not able to create that attunement ourselves. We're going to bring on some people further down the track talking about what's called ACEs and how that affects us as adults as well. Michael will talk about that in a couple of weeks. So, and then we'll get someone else who's going to talk about what adults who haven't had good attunement, how they can help their own offspring. But,
so Rose, you're saying that we just have to keep understanding and accepting ourselves.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Accepting yourself, that this is a response in your body.
As opposed to like Mia, for example, maybe tries to breathe, it doesn't work, and she begins to judge herself. Oh, I can't believe you can't get rid of that anxiety. And then that creates the cycle, like self-criticism.
Yeah. I think it's really worth in those situations investigating what's underneath the anxiety, because with the when the anxiety is being triggered by our emotions, what we find is that techniques to reduce the anxiety will work temporarily, but because we don't deal with the trigger, it keeps on being activated. So
and it moves around as well.
It moves around, exactly. So as well as having techniques that give us some sense of control over our anxiety, like breathing or meditation or grounding or exercise, as well as those, I think it really is important to come back to going on that journey with someone of understanding your feelings, really accepting yourself, as you're saying, Tova, and being curious about what's inside that wants to be heard.
Wow. Beautifully said. What's inside wants to be heard. But it not only just wants to be heard, it needs to be heard. It needs to be out there in the open. And the pain and the suffering that's gone on, relentless, unrelenting, for so long.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because our emotions are they're our compass. This is why they evolved. They're the compass that tells us the direction that we need to go in. They don't tell us how to get there, so we need to work that out on ourselves.
That's right. We don't have a map, do we?
They don't have a map, but we have a compass. And anxiety is kind of like this thing that covers up our compass. It's like the pouring down rain, and you can't see it. Just
well said. Especially in England.
Yeah, we get a lot of that in England.
Leo, could you, for our audience, give them an idea of what the trusts are doing now in the UK? Because I don't think you're quite alone with what you're doing, are you?
No, that's right. That's right. So there's been a growth of interest in understanding.
A shift, really.
Yeah, it has. It's been a real shift, and there are two parts of this. One is to do with, I think, the neuroscience that is showing us how the mind and body are connected, and that's fortunately harder and harder to ignore. And the other thing is sort of more Machiavellian, really, from the health services perspective, is that what we're seeing is that when you treat people, so you help people with these symptoms, that you can reduce their suffering without too intensive levels of input, and also you can do it without, and it saves a lot of money for trusts, because these symptoms, as Rose was saying earlier on, can jump around in a sense. So often someone who suffers with chronic anxiety, they might turn up at accident and emergency with chest pains one moment, and they might also have a referral to gastroenterology for investigations into bowel difficulties, and at the same time they might be sent to another speciality to look at their hearing, or another one to look at their vision. And I think there's just a movement in some trusts in the UK to say, actually, can we have a more holistic approach where we are helping people rather than just sort of going round and round.
So the patients that come to you from neurology, have they also been to gastroenterology? Have they also been to, like, when you look at their histories, are they big? Oh, well, they're all on the internet now, aren't they? But
so that's very much the case. So, and if usually people won't only have functional neurological symptoms, because typically the neurological type symptoms, like the weakness or paralysis or collapsing, because that's the most extreme anxiety, they've had to escalate through the levels of anxiety. And so, very often we'll see that they'll have symptoms in other areas. And, I don't know what it's like in Australia and Israel, but over here we're still dealing with records which are separated between like mental health and physical health. And
very much so. It's terrible.
There's no one putting the pieces of the jigsaw together. So really, that's one of the first things I'll go through with people, is a bit of a history of what physical symptoms they've got going on. And it's a tremendous relief to people to realize that often they might be dealing with one problem to do with anxiety and their feelings causing all these symptoms, rather than they have a gastroenterology condition and they have a neurology condition and they have a respiratory condition. You know, it's a real relief to understand how these all fit together.
They fit together, yeah. Well, Dion at St. Vincent's was sort of like, that was a really big opening that I don't know of any other department in Australia that's like that. Yeah.
It's fantastic.
So it's it looks like all the questions I think we answered. You know, I think it's something about the support, which is so important, that people, first of all, don't feel they're alone. And I just wanted to say that Rose and I are starting some groups on Zoom. Hopefully in Europe, there's one group. You know, in America, there's another. Because of the time difference, we tried to get different people from different. So we're opening up small Zoom groups to support people. We have one going now, and it's been tremendous for people. Like, you know, group therapy, I think private therapy has its benefits. Then there's the group synergy of learning from another, and then learning to feel safe, learning to feel intimate. Like you can say something to somebody and you won't hurt their feelings. Like I think these are important behaviors. So we'll let our audience know about some of the group Zooms we're working on now. And how's that work for you, Dr. Russell? Do you have groups when you work with people, or you work with one-on-one? How do you see the groups and then the individual?
Yeah, so I think, well, at the moment we've been working mainly with people individually, and that's more of a resource thing. I mean, I very much agree about the power of groups. One of the things we have in where I work in the Southwest is we have a really excellent, active service user-led group called FND Friends, which is Functional Neurological Disorder, which is, as I say, run by people who have lived experience of FND. And they're absolutely fantastic because, you know, I think it can be it's very difficult, I think, to understand what it's like to live with a functional condition, and unless you've had that condition. And we can empathize and sympathize with other experiences that we don't have. But I think there's something very powerful about being sat in a room with other people that know firsthand what it's like to go through what you've gone through. And in fact, to risk of going on a little bit, the functional neurological symptoms in the UK, and in fact around the world, there's been a really good service user-led movement, which has brought much greater understanding and has really pushed the scholarly efforts to understand symptoms.
Good.
So you know, they're doing great work, and that's, I think, really crucial to us.
So who are they?
So FND Friends. So they are
these FND Friends that are doing the push globally.
Well, so there's a group. There's FND. So I get it wrong here. There's FND Hope and FND Friends.
Okay.
And various other charities. If you search FND, you'll find them. And there's also the FND Society, which is actually it's led by.
Okay. Well, that's probably.
Yeah, that's led by clinicians, but has a very high involvement with service users. And I think this is important. Maybe it's worth saying, I fundamentally believe that the majority of functional symptoms that we see are caused or made worse by emotional factors. I think that's the majority of the time that's the case. But I think there's a whole bunch of other things that can contribute as well. And so it's really good to have a multidisciplinary team involved. As I say, you know, I've been fortunate to work with great physios and OTs and neurologists. And if we could have yoga teachers in our service, I would. If we could have chiropractors, I would. You know, I think it's just essential to work with specialists who understand the body in different ways. Because ultimately, the way to our best level of healing is learning to meet the needs of our body. And
very important.
Yeah.
Very important.
Yeah. So psychology is... Sorry, go on.
One of my colleagues, psychologist colleagues, is training to be a yoga teacher at the moment.
Oh, marvelous.
And listen, and you know what Rose and I talk about, and is, you know, and I learned this in chiropractic school, inside of us is a pharmacy. We have every medicine that we need to take care of everything we need. They used to say, we just don't need the interference. And the fact is, interference is life. So, you know, everyone is a doctor. Everyone is a yoga teacher. Everyone has the ability to stretch and move. And, you know, it's just a habit. And I think we have to answer our stress as opposed to, I'm going to fight you. We have to say, I'm going to do a little stretching. I'm going to do a little calming, a little breathing. It's like, I'm going to get up in the morning and brush my teeth, and I'm going to make that cup of coffee and have that first sip. Yeah. And I think if people would trust the habit and trust themselves, and
can I interrupt there and say that the sad part about it is they can't trust themselves in many ways because that original connection with their caregiver has been broken. So they've got no... Leo said about a compass. Yeah. But if we've got a map as well as the compass, we can get there. And so when we intervene with patients, we intervene to blow away the tears, I suppose, and open up the map so that they can use their compass. Yeah. Because the compass only shows us the north. Yeah. But we need the map because we're not always going north.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, is it worth, I don't know if we're okay for time, but I'm aware we haven't mentioned what we call defenses, which is kind of habit. And I feel that's important. I know watching last week's episode, I'm sure Dion wouldn't be happy if we missed out defenses. So I think that's
we're never happy if we miss out on defenses.
Yeah. So defenses is really just, it's a habit. It's a habit that we've developed because it was useful to us in the past. And it's automatic and outside of our consciousness, so we don't know that we're doing it.
Please give us some examples of defenses that we use.
Sure. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll give you an example and how it might emerge. So if we imagine early in life, as you express your feeling, let's say you're an infant and you feel rageful about something and you express your rage. If what happens is that your parent or the person looking after you responds to you by dismissing you, then this gives you a bit of a problem because suddenly your feeling is a danger to you because it leads to dismissing from the very person that you want care from. So this will trigger a bunch of anxiety initially because that's danger, right? So our body's going, oh, I know what to do here, anxiety. But we don't like to feel in danger. So we stumble across habits that reduce the anxiety and reduce the vulnerability. So with that parent who dismisses us when we show our feeling, we might develop a defense whereby we dismiss ourselves before they can. So we don't even get to showing our feeling because we're already beating ourselves up inside, which sounds pretty difficult, but it's preferable to that infant to beat themselves up than to have the fear of the loss of the parent.
Wow. Yeah.
But the other thing that can happen is the defense might be like a complementary defense in a way, in as much as, let's say that parent is dismissing us. Perhaps what we learn to do is rather than express our feelings, we learn to please the parent. So we focus on the other person rather than on us. So the habit that we learn over time is pleasing and focusing on the other person rather than ourselves. And that could be another defense that we carry through life.
Yeah. What's happened to Tova? Have we lost her?
Don't know. So a defense has been triggered.
Leo, thank you so much. I hope that our audience has got a lot out of this session because
Excellent.
you've covered the whole range of anxiety, defenses, pain, and suffering. And I mean, I think that most of our audience has had a lot of suffering, and to bring it to them that they're okay, and that there was a reason for the suffering, and that it can be healed, and that they don't have to give up hope on themselves. And that's why I like putting up that Tronic YouTube thing frequently for people to forgive themselves for this pain. So thank you again, Leo.
It's a real pleasure.
Yeah, it was wonderful. I love your accent. It's like Rose's a little bit, but anyway. No, we're going to bring you back. We're going to bring you back, and you did amazing with getting on the Be Live. Appreciate that.
Yes, thank you. It's been a real pleasure. I've enjoyed it.
Okay.
Great.
Good night. We'll see you
great
next.
Work.
We'll see you next week.
From Aussie. Okay.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.